The executioner's blade didn't fall, it couldn't. Not yet. The man bound before Genghis Khan in the summer of 1203 had made a critical mistake. He had betrayed the wrong warlord at precisely the wrong moment in history. What happened next would become whispered legend across the Silk Road, a tale so horrifying that mothers would use it to frighten disobedient children for 8 centuries to come. The traitor's name was Jamuka, once the Khan's blood brother, and the method of his execution would be considered merciful compared to what awaited others who dared raise their hand against the emerging Mongol Empire. On a scorching August afternoon in 1219, somewhere in the arid plains between Otrar and Bukhara, a merchant named Inalchuk made what would become the deadliest administrative decision in medieval history. As governor of the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar, he had detained a Mongol trade caravan of over 400 merchants, confiscated their goods worth thousands of gold dinars, and executed them under suspicion of espionage. When Genghis Khan's ambassadors arrived demanding justice and reparations, the Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II made an even worse choice. He had the chief ambassador beheaded and sent the others back with their beards burned off. These weren't acts of war, they were personal insults, betrayals of the sacred customs of diplomatic immunity and trade agreements that governed the civilized world. The response wouldn't be mere conquest. It would be a master class in psychological warfare, calculated cruelty, and the systematic application of terror as statecraft. The thing about Genghis Khan that most people misunderstand is this. He wasn't a mindless savage drunk on bloodlust. Born as Temujin, around 1,162 inches, the harsh wilderness of the Mongolian steppes, he had learned betrayal intimately from childhood. His father Yesugei had been poisoned by Tatar rivals when Temujin was only 9 years old. His own tribe, the Traitors, abandoned his family to starve on the steppes, viewing his widowed mother, Holun, and her children as useless mouths to feed. His half-brother Begta betrayed family loyalty, hoarding food and game, leading young Temujin and his brother Kasar to kill him with arrows in a moment that would haunt and define him. He was captured and enslaved by the Traitors, forced to wear a wooden collar called a kangu until he escaped during a feast celebration. Every betrayal carved itself into his psyche, creating not a monster, but something far more dangerous. A strategic genius who understood that mercy shown to the loyal and disproportionate punishment inflicted on traitors were two sides of the same coin of empire building. By the spring of 1206, when Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan universal ruler at a great Kurultai near the Onon River, he had already developed his philosophy of governance through blood and fire. The laws he established, later recorded in the Yasa Code, made one thing crystalline clear. Loyalty to the Khan and the Mongol state superseded all other bonds, family, tribe, religion, even self-preservation. Betrayal wasn't just a crime. It was a fundamental violation of the cosmic order he was establishing. The punishments he devised weren't acts of rage, but carefully calibrated instruments of terror designed to send messages that would echo across continents. Let's begin with Jamuka, because his story illustrates the strange contradictions in Genghis Khan's character. In 1206, after years of alternating alliance and warfare, Jamuka was finally captured by his own men, who were, ironically, hoping to gain favor with Genghis Khan through this ultimate betrayal of their leader. They presented Jamuka, bound and defeated, to the Khan, expecting reward. Instead, Genghis Khan had these traitors executed immediately and brutally. Men who would betray their own lord, he reasoned, could never be trusted by anyone. Jamuka, his former blood brother, with whom he had once pledged eternal friendship as Anda, was treated with elaborate respect. They spoke of old times, of hunting together as young men, of shared dreams under the eternal blue sky. When the time came for execution, Jamuka made a final request that he be killed without spilling his blood, as befitted a nobleman. Genghis Khan granted this wish. Jamuka was rolled into a carpet, and his back was broken by repeated blows. His body crushed until death came, but not a drop of his blood touched the ground. To the Mongols, blood was sacred, containing the soul. This was mercy, an honor afforded to a worthy enemy. But compare this to the fate of those who had betrayed Jamuka to Genghis Khan. These men weren't warriors captured in honest battle, they were oath breakers, men who had violated the sacred bond between leader and follower. According to multiple Persian and Chinese chronicles from the period, including the Secret History of the Mongols, compiled in 1228, these traitors were bound and placed face up on the ground. Heavy wooden boards were laid across their bodies, and then Mongol soldiers sat on these boards, eating and celebrating while the men beneath were slowly crushed over the course of hours. Their screams would have been audible throughout the camp, a symphony of agony designed to teach every soldier present what happened to those who betrayed their commanders. They died slowly, their bones cracking sequentially under the weight, their lungs gradually compressed until they could no longer draw breath, blood eventually seeping from their mouths and noses as their internal organs ruptured. This wasn't execution, it was theater, a public demonstration staged for maximum educational impact. The fall of 1220 brought Genghis Khan's armies to the walls of Otrar, the city whose governor had murdered his merchants and triggered this apocalyptic campaign. The siege lasted 5 months, through one of the coldest winters in recorded Central Asian history. The Persian historian Atamalik Juvaini, writing in his chronicle Tarikh-i-Jahan Gushe around 1260, described the final days of Otrar with the kind of detail that suggests he had interviewed survivors. When the walls were finally breached in February 1221, the common soldiers and citizens who surrendered were divided. Artisans and skilled workers were enslaved and sent to Mongolia. Young women were distributed among the troops. Young men were conscripted into the Mongol army as cannon fodder for future sieges, and the elderly and infirm were executed efficiently with swords. Brutal, yes, but this was the standard practice of medieval warfare. Governor Inalchuk, however, received special attention. He was the man who had personally ordered the execution of the Mongol merchants, who had confiscated their trade goods, who had committed the original betrayal of trust that had brought this entire catastrophe upon his people. Genghis Khan wanted his death to be memorable, to be discussed in every marketplace and caravanserai from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The method chosen was pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears. According to Juvaini, and later confirmed by the chronicler Rashid al-Din in his Jami al-Tawarik, compiled around 1310, Inalkuk was bound to a chair in the center of Otrar's ruined citadel, a crucible of silver, the same precious metal that had been in the confiscated caravan, was heated until it liquefied, glowing white-hot. Then, as the governor screamed and thrashed against his bonds, the molten metal was carefully poured first into his ears, the liquid burning through his ear canals into his brain, and then into his eyes, boiling them in their sockets, and melting through into his skull. The symbolism was deliberate. He had closed his eyes to justice, had closed his ears to reason and diplomacy, and had valued silver over honor. Now silver would be his doom, entering his body through the very senses he had corrupted. His death throes lasted several minutes, his body convulsing as the superheated metal destroyed his brain, before he finally went still. But Inalkuk was small punishment compared to what awaited Shah Muhammad II himself. The Shah fled before Genghis Khan's armies, abandoning his cities, his soldiers, and his people to their fate. He raced from Samarkand to Balkh, from Balkh to Nishapur, from Nishapur to Hamadan, always one step ahead of the Mongol pursuit forces led by Jebe and Subutai, two of Genghis Khan's most brilliant generals. This chase consumed the winter and spring of 1220 to 1221, crossing over 1,000 miles of territory. The psychological warfare was exquisite. At every city, the Shah would arrive exhausted, beg for shelter, and within days or weeks, news would come that the Mongols were approaching. His presence became a curse, a harbinger of destruction. City after city closed their gates to him, their leaders reasoning that perhaps the Mongols might spare them if they didn't harbor the fugitive Shah. By December 1220, Muhammad II finally reached a small island in the Caspian Sea, where he died in January 1221. The historical sources suggest either exhaustion, pleurisy, or quite possibly from the sheer stress and despair of his situation. Genghis Khan never actually caught the Shah, but in a sense, that was the point. The pursuit had turned the ruler of the vast Khwarezmian Empire into a hunted animal, had destroyed his dignity and authority more thoroughly than any execution could have. His son and successor, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, would continue fighting the Mongols with remarkable courage and skill for another decade, but the empire his father had ruled was shattered beyond repair. The betrayal of trust, of diplomatic norms, of the sacred rules that allowed civilizations to coexist and trade. These violations had been punished not just with death, but with the complete annihilation of everything the Shah had built. In the summer of 1221, the city of Nishapur made the fatal error of resisting Mongol conquest and killing Tokhchar, Genghis Khan's son-in-law, during the siege with an arrow to the throat. This wasn't just military resistance, it was personal. Tokhchar had been married to Genghis Khan's daughter, Alakai Beki, making him family. When the city finally fell in April 1221, after Genghis Khan's son Tolui arrived with reinforcements specifically to avenge Tokhchar's death, the orders given were explicit and horrifying. According to multiple contemporary sources, including the Armenian chronicler Grigor of Akank and the Persian historian Ibn al-Athir, every living thing in Nishapur was to be killed. Not just the soldiers, not just the men, everything. Dogs, cats, livestock, and most horrifically, every human being, including infants. The execution took several days to complete. The Mongols systematically went through every building, every cellar, every hiding place. They decapitated the corpses and piled the heads into separate pyramids, one of men's heads, one of women's heads, and one of children's heads. These pyramids were constructed in the city's main square as monuments to the price of killing Mongol nobility. But even in this apocalyptic slaughter, a distinction was made. The soldiers who had defended the walls, who had fought honorably even if on the losing side, were killed quickly with swords or arrows. The city's leaders, however, the governor, the military commanders, the wealthy merchants who had funded the resistance, these men were identified and set aside for special treatment. They were subjected to what the Mongols called cleaning or combing the city. This involved torturing each prominent person to death in creative ways, usually in front of their assembled family members, before those family members were also killed. The methods varied. Some were flayed alive, their skin removed in strips while they remained conscious. Some were sawed in half vertically, starting from the groin, a method so slow that victims often remained alive and aware until the saw reached their chest. Others were subjected to the rat torture, where rats were placed in a heated metal container against the victim's abdomen. And as the container grew hot, the rats would burrow through the flesh, seeking cooler refuge, essentially eating their way through the person's body. A Franciscan friar named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, who traveled through former Mongol-conquered territories in the 1,240 seconds on a mission from Pope Innocent IV, collected accounts of these punishments in his Historia Mongolorum. He describes one torture reserved specifically for nobles and religious leaders who had called for resistance. The victim was tied to a wooden frame, his abdomen was cut open, and one end of his intestines was nailed to a tree or post. Then the victim was forced to walk in circles around the post while his intestines unspooled from his body. Death came from shock, blood loss, or infection, but the process ensured maximum suffering and created a grotesque spectacle. The year 1223 saw the Mongol reconnaissance force under Gebei and Subutai penetrate deep into the Caucasus and southern Russia, eventually meeting a coalition of Russian princes and Cuman, Kipchak Turks at the Battle of Kalka River on May 31. The Mongols won decisively through superior tactics and coordination, but what happened after the battle reveals another dimension of Genghis Khan's philosophy regarding betrayal. The Cuman Turks, who had initially stood with the Russian princes, fled the battlefield when the fighting turned against them. The Mongols pursued and destroyed the fleeing Cuman forces, but those Cumans who later returned and offered to submit to Mongol authority were accepted with relatively little punishment. They had been defeated enemies, but not traitors or oath-breakers. The Russian princes were different. They had requested peace negotiations after their forces were surrounded, offering treasure and hostages in exchange for their lives. According to the Novgorod Chronicle and later Russian sources, Gebei and Subutai agreed, promising that not a drop of your blood will be shed. The princes were taken prisoner under this guarantee. Then, Staying technically true to their word, the Mongol commanders had the princes placed under heavy wooden platforms, and the Mongol commanders held their victory feast on these platforms while the Russian nobles suffocated and were crushed beneath them. No blood was spilled, but the princes died slowly over several hours, able to hear the celebration above them, knowing they had been outmaneuvered diplomatically, just as they had been defeated militarily. This wasn't just execution, it was a philosophical statement about the nature of agreements, the precision of language, and the danger of trusting in half measures when dealing with the Mongols. In 1226, Genghis Khan launched his final campaign against the Western Xia kingdom, which had failed to provide the military support they had promised for his earlier campaigns, a betrayal of their vassal obligations. The Tangut people of Western Xia had been tributaries of the Mongols since 1209, but their ruler Li Dewang had repeatedly made promises and then broken them, believing the Mongols were too occupied elsewhere to enforce compliance. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Genghis Khan, now in his 60s and feeling his mortality approaching, became obsessed with punishing this betrayal before his death. The campaign through 1226 to 1227 was characterized by unusual brutality, even by Mongol standards. Cities that surrendered immediately were still sacked and their populations enslaved. Those that resisted were annihilated so thoroughly that several Tangut cities have never been definitively located by archaeologists. They were literally erased from the earth. Li Dewang died during the siege of the Western Xia capital Zhongxing in early 1227, and his nephew Li Xian assumed the throne and immediately sued for peace. Genghis Khan accepted the surrender but died himself in August 1227 during the campaign, possibly from internal injuries sustained in a fall from his horse, though sources differ on the exact cause. Before his death, he gave explicit orders regarding the treatment of the Western Xia. After he died, his commanders carried out these final commands with meticulous precision. The entire Western Xia royal family was executed. The new emperor, Li Xian, and all of his relatives, including distant cousins, were systematically hunted down and killed. The Buddhist temples that had supported the dynasty were burned, their monks executed, their libraries destroyed. The irrigation systems that had made Western Xia's agriculture possible were deliberately ruined. The goal wasn't just political conquest, it was civilizational erasure, removing the Western Xia as an ethnic and cultural entity from history as punishment for their betrayal. But the methods of execution for the Western Xia nobility demonstrated refinements in torture that the Mongols had developed over decades of conquest. The secret history of the Mongols is circumspect about details, but Persian and Chinese sources fill in the gaps. One favored method for nobles who had personally advised their rulers to break treaties with the Mongols was the wheel. The victim was tied to a large wooden wagon wheel with ropes at the wrists, ankles, and neck. The wheel was then slowly rotated over a fire, cooking the victim gradually, rotating them to ensure even heat distribution. They would first lose consciousness from the heat and smoke, their skin would blister and char, and eventually the proteins in their blood would denature from the heat, causing cardiac arrest. The process took hours and was performed in public spaces to ensure maximum witnessing. Another method reserved for religious leaders who had blessed rebellion against Mongol rule was far more psychologically sophisticated. These monks or shamans would be forced to watch as their monasteries or temples burned, their religious texts destroyed, and their fellow priests killed. Only after witnessing the complete destruction of everything they had dedicated their lives to would they themselves be executed, often by being sewn into yak skins or leather bags, which were then thrown into rivers. The skins would shrink as they became waterlogged, slowly constricting and suffocating the person inside, while they tumbled in the current, unable to swim, unable to breathe, dying in complete darkness. The symbolic message was clear. You betrayed your sacred duty, so you die in a manner that denies you proper burial rites, your body never to be recovered or honored. Throughout all of these campaigns, Genghis Khan maintained a crucial distinction that reveals the systematic nature of his approach to punishment. Soldiers who fought against the Mongols but did so bravely and honorably were often offered the chance to join the Mongol army. Civilians who simply lived in cities that chose to resist were treated as enemy non-combatants, enslaved or conscripted, but not tortured. The special torments, the elaborate and horrific executions, were reserved for specific categories of betrayal. Oath breakers who had pledged loyalty and then reneged, diplomatic traitors who violated sacred customs of embassy and hospitality, military commanders who surrendered under terms and then broke their parole, religious or political leaders who encouraged rebellion after submitting, and nobles who betrayed their own people to curry favor with the Mongols. This last category is particularly revealing. Throughout the Mongol conquests, there were numerous cases of local elites who, seeing the writing on the wall, attempted to betray their own rulers to gain favor with the approaching Mongols. Almost universally, Genghis Khan had these would-be collaborators executed in the most brutal manner possible, often in front of the very Mongol commanders they had been trying to impress. His logic was impeccable. If a man would betray his own people when threatened, he would betray anyone. Such people had no honor, no loyalty, no value. In a sense, these collaborative traitors received worse treatment than any enemy, because at least enemies who fought against the Mongols had demonstrated courage and loyalty to their cause. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo, traveling through the Mongol Empire several decades after Genghis Khan's death in the 1270s, collected stories about the Great Khan's justice system that had become legendary. In his travels, he describes a case that supposedly occurred around 1216, involving a Mongol noble named Guyuk Khan, who betrayed a planned military strategy to Chinese defenders in exchange for gold. When this betrayal was discovered, Genghis Khan had the traitor brought before him along with the gold he had received. The gold was melted down in front of Guyuk, and then, according to the story, Genghis Khan had the molten gold poured down the traitor's throat. "You desired gold above all things," the Khan supposedly said. "Now you shall have all the gold you can stomach." Whether this specific incident occurred exactly as Marco Polo described is debatable. His accounts sometimes conflate different events or exaggerate for dramatic effect, but The story circulated because it captured something essential about Genghis Khan's approach to traitors: the punishment metaphorically connected to the crime. This principle of symbolic justice appears repeatedly in documented Mongol executions. A messenger who had been bribed to deliver false information was executed by having his tongue cut out and then nailed to a tree. He had misused his tongue, so his tongue became the instrument of his death. A quartermaster who had sold military supplies on the black market rather than distributing them to troops was executed by being force-fed the grain he had stolen until his stomach ruptured. A scout who had deliberately given false reports about enemy positions was blinded and then released to wander the steppe until he died of exposure. These weren't random cruelties, but calculated messages that the Mongol legal system, as brutal as it was, operated on principles and logic. By the time Genghis Khan died in August 1227, he had created an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, and he had done so through a combination of brilliant military strategy, innovative administrative practices, religious tolerance, meritocratic promotions, and absolutely ruthless enforcement of loyalty through terror. The various methods of execution and torture he employed weren't aberrations or the actions of a sadist. They were policy instruments, carefully deployed to maintain order across an empire too vast to control through military presence alone. Every horrific execution was a message sent to thousands of people who would hear about it. Every traitor left to die in an elaborate public spectacle was a lesson that would be remembered and discussed for years. Modern historians sometimes struggle with how to assess Genghis Khan's legacy. On one hand, he created systems of law, promoted trade across the Silk Road, valued expertise over nobility of birth, and generally allowed religious freedom within his empire. The Pax Mongolica that his empire eventually created allowed for unprecedented exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West. On the other hand, the death toll of his conquests is staggering. Estimates range from 30 to 40 million people died during the Mongol conquests, roughly 11% of the world's total population at the time. Many of these deaths came from the systematic destruction of cities, the deliberate targeting of agricultural infrastructure, and the use of terror as a weapon of war. But when we focus specifically on traitors and rebels, what emerges is a portrait of a ruler who valued loyalty above all other virtues and who saw betrayal as the ultimate crime against civilization itself. This made sense given his personal history. He had risen from being an abandoned orphan on the steppe to ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in history. At every stage of that rise, loyalty from his followers had been essential, and betrayal from enemies or false friends had been the primary threat to his survival. The elaborate tortures reserved for traitors weren't expressions of personal vindictiveness. They were the systematic application of a worldview that saw loyalty as the fundamental glue holding society together. The fate of the Khwarezmian Empire, destroyed in 1220 to 1221, primarily because its Shah had betrayed diplomatic norms by murdering ambassadors, remained a cautionary tale throughout the medieval period. When European kings and Chinese emperors later received Mongol embassies in the 1230 seconds and 1240 seconds, The memory of what had happened to Shah Muhammad II for mistreating Mongol diplomats made them scrupulously respectful, even when rejecting Mongol demands. The message had been received. You could fight the Mongols and die honorably, or you could submit and live under their rule. But betrayal, breaking oaths, violating diplomatic immunity, rebelling after submitting, these were unforgivable sins that would bring down apocalyptic retribution, not just on you, but on your entire civilization. Even within the Mongol Empire itself, the standards set by Genghis Khan created a cultural expectation of loyalty that lasted for generations. The civil wars that eventually tore apart the unified Mongol Empire in the decades after his death were brutal affairs, but they followed certain rules. Commanders who switched sides in the midst of campaigns were often executed by the very forces they were trying to join. The cultural memory of how Genghis Khan had treated traitors made such betrayals nearly suicidal, even when they might have been strategically advantageous. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Genghis Khan's treatment of traitors was the way he created hierarchies of betrayal and corresponding hierarchies of punishment. A common soldier who deserted his post might be executed, but quickly with an arrow or sword. An officer who betrayed his men would die more slowly and painfully. A general who switched sides after taking bribes would suffer elaborate tortures before death. A vassal king who rebelled after swearing fealty would see his entire kingdom destroyed and his bloodline exterminated. And someone who betrayed personal friendship or family bonds, like those who betrayed Jamukha, would be executed in ways that denied them any honor or dignity, their deaths designed to erase them from memory rather than create martyrs. This scaling of punishment, according to the severity of betrayal, created a system that was brutal but not indiscriminate. It acknowledged degrees of guilt and proportionality, even if the proportions involved were horrifying by modern standards. A person living under Mongol rule in the 1220 seconds could theoretically predict what would happen to them based on what they had done. Ordinary resistance would be met with ordinary conquest and subjugation. Betrayal after submission would be met with extraordinary torture and death. This predictability was itself a form of psychological control. People could choose their fate by choosing their actions. The historical evidence suggests that this system worked, at least on its own terms. Rebellions within Mongol-controlled territories were remarkably rare, considering how quickly the empire expanded. Cities and regions conquered by Genghis Khan and his sons tended to stay conquered, with their populations apparently deciding that submission was preferable to the alternative. The trade routes across the empire flourished because merchants knew the Mongols would protect them from bandits and enforce contracts. The memory of what happened to those who harmed traders at Otrar saw to that. The diplomatic system functioned because ambassadors moved freely under protection that everyone understood was sacred. Violating it meant civilizational suicide. As Genghis Khan lay dying in his campaign tent in August 1227, he was surrounded by his sons and key generals. According to several accounts, his final instructions to them included specific guidance on maintaining loyalty within the empire. He used a famous parable, asking each son to break a single arrow, which they did easily. Then he bundled several arrows together and asked them to break the bundle, which they could not. "That is the strength of unity and loyalty," he reportedly said. "Separately, you can be broken. Together you are unbreakable. Any of you who betrays this unity, who breaks the bundle for personal gain, has earned the punishment of traitors." The immediate aftermath of his death saw his wishes carried out with precision. His body was returned to Mongolia in secret, with anyone who encountered the funeral procession being killed to prevent the burial location from becoming known. It remains undiscovered to this day. The final destruction of Western Xia was completed as his last command. His empire was divided among his sons, but the legal codes he had established, including the harsh punishments for betrayal, remained in force across all Mongol territories. In the decades and centuries that followed, the stories of what happened to those who betrayed Genghis Khan took on mythological proportions. Some accounts are clearly exaggerated or fantastical, but the core truth underlying these stories, that betrayal of the Mongol state, was met with calculated, systematic, and horrifying punishment designed to deter any future betrayals, is well documented across multiple independent sources in different languages and cultures. Chinese annals, Persian histories, Russian chronicles, Armenian accounts, and European traveler narratives all converge on this essential truth. Genghis Khan had created a system where loyalty was rewarded and betrayal was punished with a creativity and thoroughness that made it fundamentally irrational to break faith with the Mongol Empire. The legacy of these policies extended far beyond Genghis Khan's lifetime. His grandson Mungka Khan, ruling from 1251 to 1259, applied similar principles when dealing with conspiracies within the Mongol nobility. His brother Kublai Khan, founder of the Yuan dynasty in China, maintained harsh punishments for Chinese officials who engaged in corruption or rebellion. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, all of these successor states to Genghis Khan's unified empire retained elements of his legal code and his philosophy regarding traitors well into the 14th century. What makes Genghis Khan's treatment of traitors particularly significant from a historical perspective is how it reveals the transition from tribal to imperial governance. In his youth on the steppes, betrayal was personal, one man betraying another, one clan abandoning another. The punishments were immediate and personal. But as his power grew, betrayal became conceptualized as a crime against the state, against the social order itself. The punishments became systematized, performed publicly, designed to communicate messages to broad audiences. This represented a sophisticated understanding of how large-scale political systems function, how fear can be weaponized not through random violence, but through predictable, proportional responses to specific transgressions. The historical record shows us a man who was capable of great mercy to defeated enemies, who fought honorably, who promoted men based on talent rather than birth, who protected religious freedom and encouraged trade and scholarship. But that same record shows us someone who viewed betrayal as the ultimate crime, deserving of punishment so severe they would echo through history as warnings to future generations. The executioner's blade that didn't fall on Jamuka in 1206 because he deserved better, the molten silver poured into Inalchuk's eyes in 1221 because he deserved worse, the systematic elimination of entire royal bloodlines, and the construction of pyramids from the skulls of the slain. These weren't contradictions in Genghis Khan's character, but expressions of a single, coherent philosophy of power, loyalty, and justice. Standing here in 2026, nearly 8 centuries after Genghis Khan's death, we can look back at his treatment of traitors with a mixture of horror and fascination. Horror because the methods employed violate every modern conception of human rights and proportionate punishment. Fascination because they worked. They created loyalty through terror in a way that allowed a nomadic warrior from the edges of nowhere to build and maintain an empire that changed world history. The tortures he reserved for traitors weren't random acts of cruelty, but carefully calibrated tools of statecraft, messages written in blood and bone that could be read by anyone with eyes to see, that they still unsettle us today, that we still talk about them, that the name Genghis Khan still evokes both awe and terror, suggests that those messages were crafted with a sophistication that transcended his era and continues to resonate across the centuries.